So how do factoring and the zero product property actually help you? Well, they allow us to solve any equation that's a higher order than just an x to the 1, a linear equation. And so we're going to try out a few of those. We're going to use these steps. First of all, you should write the equation in standard form. Or, as I would say, you should set it equal to 0. And the reason I say that's more important is if you had 25 minus x squared equals 0, this is not in standard form because the x squared isn't written first, but it's easily factorable. And so it's more important that it's set equal to 0 and is in a factorable form. So let's see, what are you allowed to do once you've written your equation in standard form or set it equal to 0, you've factored your polynomial, you've set each factor or each set of parentheses equal to 0, and you've solved each of those. What is it you're allowed to do on the way? Well, it is okay to divide both sides of the equation by a number, okay? You are allowed to divide by a number. So I could divide all 3 of my terms by a 6. Everybody would get divided by 6, and we would be left with, and I'll put this on the side, 2x squared minus x equals 0. You are totally allowed to divide by a number should you want to. What you are not allowed to do is you are not allowed to divide by a variable. That is a definite no-no. So if I wanted to divide everybody by x, the reason you're not allowed to do that is because when you do that, there's a very good chance you're actually dividing by 0 and not knowing it, which is not allowed. And you're also losing the other a solution. You're losing either the second solution or a solution. So we don't want to factor, we don't want to divide variables. We want to factor them out. The last things that you are not supposed to do is you should not have a negative, so you should not have a negative length or time, because distance and time cannot be negative. So in this case, we are going to look at this rectangle. We know that the area of a rectangle is equal to length times width, or base times height. So we're going to fill in everything we know. We know that the area is 45. We know that the length is x minus 2. We know that the width is x minus 14. Now, it is great that it's factored, but as you can see, it is not set equal to 0. So since that isn't a 0, we're going to have to multiply this all out and set the whole thing equal to 0. So I'm going to start by either double distributing or foiling, however you want to think of it. So I'm going to do x times x is x squared minus 14x. Then I'm going to multiply these ones, and I'm going to get negative 2x plus 28. And I'm going to combine my like terms in the middle. So I should get that 45 is equal to x squared minus 16x plus 28. Well, we don't want to factor that because the whole point of it is to bring all the terms to one side and set it equal to 0. So I'm going to bring that 45 over by subtracting 45 from both sides. Okay? And we want to combine like terms, so I'm going to subtract the 45. I'm going to scroll up a little, and we're going to get that 0 is equal to x squared minus 16x, and 45 minus 28 is going to be 17, but since it's a negative 45, you're really going to get negative 17. So we have to pause for a moment and ask ourselves, what two things will multiply to give me a negative 17 and together will give me a negative 16? Again, it's a minus sign, so you are looking to find two things that multiply to give you 17 and subtract to give you 16, and it's 17 and 1. We want it to equal negative 16, so we want it to be a minus 17 plus 1. We're going to get our parentheses. X squared is going to be x and x. And the 17, to make the 17, we know we need a minus 17 and a plus 1. This all equals 0. So we've set it equal to 0. We have factored it, and now we need to solve for each of these parentheses. What would it take to make this first parentheses 0? A regular 17. What would it take to make this second parentheses equal 0? A negative 1. So the solution to the math is x equals negative 1 and x equals 17. But what is the actual solution to the problem? Can x equal negative 1? And the answer is no. If you plug negative 1 into either of these spots, you would get that this side is negative 15, and you would get that the other side is negative 3. That rectangle is impossible. So negative 1 is an extraneous answer. It's not an answer that's a solution to our problem. So x equals 17. What are the dimensions? Well, let's plug in 17. 17 minus 14 is going to be 3. And 17 minus 2 is going to be 15. So the dimensions of this are 3 by 15. We can talk more in class about how and where this formula comes from, but this is the formula that is used for falling objects. And this is where our math no-nos are going to come into play as far as you can't have a negative length or time, because our variable here stands for time in seconds. And so we can't have a negative answer. That's not a possibility. It is possible to have 0 seconds. It's at the very beginning of the jump, the drop, the fall, whatever is happening. But we can't have a negative time. The formula for falling objects on Earth when we are in feet is negative 16t squared plus v sub I t plus s. You can see that there's another equation that has a v sub 0 or v naught. All that means is the initial or starting. They use 0 as the start. So what do all of these things mean? Well, h is the final height. It's the height at any given moment. What is your final height after 2 seconds? What is the final height after 5 seconds? If the final height is the ground, how long before something hits the ground? The final height is 0, because the ground is 0 feet. Now, your initial velocity, v sub I, that is your starting velocity. So what you really need to understand is if you drop something or you just step off, you have no initial velocity. And that's usually pretty wonderful because you can cancel out that whole term. And then finally, S is your starting height. It's how high up you are. If you are starting from the ground, you are like a frog leaping, or you're shooting fireworks from the ground, your starting height is 0. But if you're on a diving board, your starting height is however high up that board is. So we're going to follow these little tips. Once we fill in all of the info, we're going to ask, is there a number you can divide out of all terms? Because it is okay to divide both sides by a number. So let's see how this all works. In this particular case, they gave you the equation. So you don't have to figure anything out. But let's go over what the different parts are. So Here's h, all right? So at any given time, how high up are we? Our initial velocity, our v sub I, is this 10, and it's a plus 10, so it means we are jumping upwards at a force of 10 feet per second. And this 26 means we are starting at a cliff that is 26 feet above the water. So we want to know, if the diver leaps off the cliff, how long before she hits the water. So let's see what we can do. I'm going to recopy this equation down here, and I'm going to write 0. I'm going to plug in my 0, and I'm going to put 0 equals negative 16t squared plus 10t plus 26. I personally have a very hard time factoring when it is a negative t squared. And since every single one of these terms is even, I'm going to divide both sides of the equation by a negative 2 so I can get rid of that negative in front. So I will end up with 0 equals, these two negatives are going to become positive 8t squared. 10 divided by negative 2 is negative 5t, and 26 divided by negative 2 is negative 13. I did that because I wasn't actually interested in multiplying 16 times 26. I can see that that's a very large number. So I find this personally more easily factorable. So I'm going to draw my little x on this side, and I'm going to try and find two things that will multiply 8 times negative 13, two things that will multiply to give me negative 104, and together will give me that negative 5. It's a negative 104, so they have to be opposite signs. I'm looking for two numbers that multiply to give me negative 104 and subtract to give me 5. They have to be close together because 1 times 104, that's not going to give you 5. 2 times 52, that's nowhere near going to give you 5. You need numbers that are close together. And since I don't really know a lot of things that go into 104, why not take a stab at the original two things I multiplied, 8 and 13. And those two can make a 5 when we subtract them. So one of them is 8, one of them is 13, and we want the 13 to be negative so that we can get that negative 5. So now it's time to factor. I am not going to factor by grouping simply because I want to keep this video short. So I am going to show you again how I figure this out. My outer and inner terms will need to equal 8 and negative 13. The reason this method might not be a bad idea is because there's only one way to divvy up 13, and it's with a 13 and a 1. 8t squared, yeah, it could be 8t and t, or it could be 4t and 2t, but I need to make 13 and 8, and this is already going to be 13 if I just use a t, and if I use 8t for the other part, here's my 8t. I want the 13 to be negative, so the negative goes there. So when all is said and done, this is how it actually factors. I'm going to erase this extra information, and we now need to solve this. We need to find out, what would it take to make the first parentheses equal 0? Well, that's going to be a negative 1. So t equals negative 1. What would it take to make this parentheses equal 0? Well, let's do that out. We're going to add 13 to both sides so that we have 8t is equal to 13. This is gross. It doesn't go in evenly, so I'm going to divide both sides by 8. And I'm going to get 13 over 8, and that is an okay answer. That is a little bit more than 1. It's probably a little bit more than 8.5. Than 1.5. So this is a little bit more than 1 second. That's all it's going to take her to fall 26 feet. And that's with a jump up into the air. Even though t does equal -1, that is a solution to the math, you cannot have it take -1 seconds. It doesn't take you -1 seconds to fall to the water. So the only answer is 13/8, or you could do the math out and divide it. You would get 1 5/8, or you would get 1.625 seconds. Either one is great. I wouldn't round it. I would leave it like that. Okay, and I think it's important that you know how to set up the equation. The other one, it gave it to you, but we need to know, how do you plug everything in? How do you translate the words into a math problem? So you can see that there's a very, very light gray underneath, and that's just so I can write over the numbers. It says you drop a set of keys from your 25-foot high window down to your friend below. She doesn't catch them. How long before the keys hit the ground? Well, we want to know how long it's going to take before these keys hit the ground. They're hitting the ground. The final height is 0. It said that she dropped these keys. So she dropped them. There's no initial velocity. If the initial velocity were 0, this whole thing cancels out. We don't even have to deal with that term, which is really nice. And then finally, it's a starting height. It's a 25-foot window. So this is the problem that we're doing. If I were to solve this, I would either multiply everybody by a -1 so that I was solving this problem, because again, I don't like to have a -16t squared, and then that guy would get a negative, or I would just have them flip-flop. Instead of having it being -16t squared, I would write it as 25 minus 16t squared. In both cases, take a look. You have a difference of 2 perfect squares. And so this is going to factor really nicely. But let's practice setting up the next one. Again, we have, we'll use a lighter gray, a darker gray this time. We're going to write h equals -16t squared plus visa by t plus s. Let's plug in everybody we know. What do we know right now? Well, we know that how long before he reaches the ground again? The ground is the answer. So that is going to be 0. What is the initial velocity? Well, let's take a look. Is there one? It says the frog jumps upward at a rate of 4 feet per second. So it does have some initial velocity. So we're going to fill in 4, and it's positive. So we're going to put 4 there. And finally, it says a frog jumps upward at a rate. How long before he reaches the ground again? That means that he started at the ground, leaped up, and eventually hit the ground again. So his starting height is 0. So we can totally erase this. Ooh, we cannot. We can totally erase this s, so that's gone. That's 0. So the problem that we're actually solving is 0 equals -16t squared plus 4. And again, I would do what I did above. I would either multiply by a -1, or I would switch this order and write it as 4 minus 16t squared. And you can see easily that that is a difference of 2 squares. You could also just divide out a 4 from everywhere if you wanted.